The sound of their laughter still echoes in my head 3 months later. Not the kind of laughter you hear at a celebration or when someone tells a good joke. No, this was different. It was the sharp, cutting kind that slices through your chest and leaves you breathless, the kind that says you're nothing. You've always been nothing, and now that he's gone, you're even less than that. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stood there in my black dress, the one I'd bought specifically for Harold's funeral because nothing in my closet seemed appropriate for burying the man I'd shared 42 years with. The fabric was stiff and uncomfortable, scratching against my skin like a reminder that this wasn't really my life anymore. The funeral parlor smelled of lilies and furniture polish, that artificial sweetness that's supposed to comfort, but only makes everything feel more surreal. Harold's family filled the front rows like they owned the place. His brother Marcus sat with his arms crossed, checking his watch every few minutes like he had somewhere more important to be. Harold's sister Janet kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, but I could see her scanning the room, counting heads, probably calculating how much the service was costing. And then there were the cousins, the nephews, the distant relatives who hadn't spoken to Harold in years but showed up anyway because, well, that's what you do when someone dies. They whispered among themselves during the service, not even trying to be discreet about it. I caught fragments of their conversations, words that stung worse than any slap. Poor thing. What's she going to do now? Harold always said she couldn't balance a checkbook to save her life. At least there's the life insurance, though I doubt it's much. Each word felt like a small betrayal, not just of me but of the man lying in the casket, just 10 feet away. The worst part wasn't even what they said, it was how they looked at me, like I was already a ghost, fading away now that Harold was gone, like I was just an accessory to his life, something that would need to be packed away with his clothes and golf clubs. When Marcus stood up to give the eulogy, he talked about Harold's business sense, his dedication to family, his love of fishing. He mentioned me exactly once, calling me Harold's devoted wife like that was my entire identity, my only contribution to a marriage that had lasted longer than some of these people had been alive. After the service, they gathered in the church basement for the reception. I watched them pile their plates high with the sandwiches and cookies I'd spent 3 days preparing, the same recipes I'd made for every family gathering for decades. Nobody thanked me for the food, nobody asked how I was holding up. They just ate and talked around me like I wasn't there. That's when it started. The real conversation, the one they'd been holding back during the service. Janet was the first to bring it up, her voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. Well, I suppose we should talk about what happens now. Harold's gone. God rest his soul, and Vera's going to need help figuring things out. Marcus nodded gravely, like he was accepting a tremendous burden. Harold always handled the finances. Vera never had to worry about any of it. He said it like it was a kindness, like Harold had been protecting me from the complicated world of money and investments. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been handling our books for 20 years. Harold had been brilliant at making money, but he was terrible at keeping track of it. I was the one who balanced the accounts, paid the bills, made sure we weren't spending more than we earned, but they didn't see that. They just saw Harold's quiet little wife, the one who made coffee and smiled at their jokes and never caused any trouble, the one who would probably need their help now that her provider was gone. The house is probably too much for her to manage alone, added cousin Robert, a man who'd visited exactly twice in the past decade. All those rooms, all that upkeep, she'd be better off in something smaller, maybe one of those senior communities. They talked about me like I wasn't standing right there, like I was a problem to be solved, a responsibility to be divided up among them. Harold's nephew David suggested I might want to sell the house and move closer to his mother in Florida. Janet thought I should consider assisted living, just to be safe. Marcus wondered aloud if I understood anything about insurance policies or retirement accounts. I stood there with my cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, listening to them plan my life like I was incapable of making my own decisions. And then Janet said the thing that broke something inside me. She was talking to her daughter Sarah, but she said it loud enough for half the room to hear. Poor Harold, he tried so hard to take care of her, always worried about what would happen if he went first. He used to say she wouldn't know what to do with herself, financially speaking. Thank goodness the life insurance will cover the basics, but she's going to have to learn to live much more simply now. That's when they laughed. Not all of them, but enough. It started as a few chuckles, the kind people make when someone states the obvious, but it grew into something uglier, something that felt like relief, like they were happy to have it confirmed that I was exactly what they'd always thought I was: helpless, dependent, pitiable. I set my coffee cup down on the nearest table and walked out. Not dramatically, not with any grand gesture. I just left. I got in my car and drove home to the empty house that was suddenly too quiet, too full of Harold's absence and their assumptions about my future. That night, I sat in Harold's study, surrounded by the files and folders he'd kept so meticulously organized: bills in one drawer, insurance papers in another, investment statements, filed by date and type. I knew where everything was because I'd been the one organizing it for years. I'd been the one making sure the property taxes were paid on time, that the utility bills didn't pile up, that our credit cards were paid off every month. I pulled out Harold's will, the one we'd updated just 2 years ago. I'd read it before, of course. We'd gone over it together when the lawyer explained everything. But that night, I read it again, slowly, carefully, looking for something I might have missed, and that's when I saw the addendum that Harold had insisted on, the one that had made me uncomfortable at the time because it seemed so unlike him, the one that mentioned assets I'd never fully understood, investments he'd made that he'd always been vague about when I asked. I thought about their laughter, about the way they'd talked around me like I was already gone. I thought about their plans for my life, their assumptions about my helplessness, their relief at having one less complicated person to deal with. They had no idea what was coming. My name is Vera Mitchell, and until 3 months ago, I was invisible. Not literally, of course, but in all the ways that mattered to the people around me. I was Harold's wife, the woman who stood beside him at family gatherings, with a pleasant smile and a casserole dish. I was the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, who sent thank you notes for wedding gifts, who organized the holiday dinners that everyone attended but no one helped clean up after. For 42 years, I played that role perfectly. I was the supporting character in Harold's story, and I was fine with that, or at least, I thought I was. It's funny how you can convince yourself that being underestimated is the same thing as being content, that being overlooked is the same as being at peace. Harold and I met in 1979 at a community college in Ohio, where I was studying accounting, and he was taking business classes. I was 21, fresh out of my parents' house, working part-time at a local diner to pay for my education. Harold was 23, already working at a small construction company during the day, and going to school at night, because he had big dreams, and the determination to make them real. What attracted me to Harold wasn't his ambition, though I admired that. It wasn't his looks, though he was handsome enough with his dark hair and easy smile. What drew me to him was his certainty. Harold knew exactly who he was, and where he was going. He had plans, real plans, with timelines and backup strategies and contingencies for his contingency. In a world that often felt chaotic and uncertain, Harold was solid ground. We married in 1981, a small ceremony in my parents' backyard with maybe 50 people in attendance. I wore my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit my smaller frame, and Harold wore a navy suit he'd bought specifically for the occasion. We couldn't afford a honeymoon, so we spent our wedding night in the same apartment Harold had been renting since he started work. It had thin walls and a leaky faucet, but it was ours. I finished my accounting degree 6 months after we married, but Harold had other ideas about my career. We don't need 2 people working full-time, he said, not if we're smart about it. You handle the books for my business ventures, and I'll handle everything else. It seemed reasonable at the time. Harold was already making good money in construction, and he had plans to start his own company. He needed someone he could trust to manage the financial side, someone who understood numbers and wouldn't ask too many questions about his more creative accounting methods. So that's what I did. I became the invisible partner in Harold Mitchell Construction. On paper I was just the bookkeeper, the one who filed the paperwork and made sure the taxes were paid on time. In reality, I was the one who structured his deals. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Who found the loopholes that saved us thousands in taxes every year? Who managed the complex web of LLCs and partnerships that Harold created to protect his assets? Harold was brilliant at seeing opportunity. He could walk through a rundown neighborhood and envision exactly how it would look in 10 years, which properties to buy, which to avoid, how to time the renovations to maximize profit. But he was terrible at the details. He'd make handshake deals and forget to get them in writing. He'd agree to payment terms that made no sense. He'd start projects without proper permits or insurance. That's where I came in. I was the one who cleaned up his messes, who turned his grand visions into workable business plans. I negotiated with contractors, dealt with city planners, managed our relationships with banks and investors. Harold got the credit because his name was on the company, because he was the one shaking hands and making speeches at Chamber of Commerce meetings. But I was the engine that made it all work. The family never saw that side of our partnership. When they came to dinner, they saw Harold holding court at the head of the table, telling stories about his latest project while I served the meal and cleared the dishes. They saw him writing checks for their kids' graduation gifts, while I quietly managed the household budget that made those generous gestures possible. They saw the successful businessman and his devoted wife, never suspecting that the wife was the one making sure the business stayed successful. Even Harold sometimes forgot how much I contributed. Not deliberately, I don't think, but success has a way of rewriting history. The longer Harold Mitchell Construction thrived, the more Harold began to believe that he'd built it all himself. He'd talk about his decisions and his strategies, conveniently forgetting the late nights we'd spent together going over contracts and tax implications. I didn't mind, or at least I told myself I did. Marriage is about partnership, about supporting each other's dreams, even when the support goes unrecognized. Harold was a good husband in the ways that mattered to me. He was faithful, reliable, generous with his family and friends. He never raised his voice to me, never made me feel small or stupid. He just never made me feel essential either. The house we bought in 1987 reflected Harold's taste more than mine. It was a large colonial in the best neighborhood in town, with 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms and a 2-car garage that Harold filled with tools and equipment for his various projects. The kitchen was enormous, perfect for entertaining, with granite countertops and professional-grade appliances that I used to prepare meals for Harold's business associates and family gatherings. I decorated the house the way Harold liked it, with heavy furniture and dark colors that made everything feel substantial and expensive. The walls were covered with Harold's awards and recognition plaques, photos from Chamber of Commerce events, framed newspaper articles about his latest development projects. There were pictures of us together, of course, but they were always group shots from company parties or family events. Harold at the center, me standing slightly behind him, smiling but somehow secondary. The study became Harold's domain, with its leather furniture and built-in bookshelves lined with business journals and investment guides. He'd spend hours in there, on the phone with clients or poring over blueprints for his next project. I had a small desk in the corner where I worked on the books, but it was clearly understood that this was Harold's space. When people came to the house for business meetings, they met with Harold in his study while I served coffee and made sure they weren't disturbed. We never had children, not by choice but by circumstance. We tried for several years in our early marriage, but it just never happened. The doctors couldn't find anything specifically wrong with either of us, but month after month, year after year, there was no pregnancy. We talked about adoption, went to a few meetings, filled out some paperwork, but Harold's business was growing so quickly that it never seemed like the right time. Eventually, we just stopped talking about it. Harold threw himself into his work with even more intensity, and I focused on supporting him. We told ourselves that we were complete as we were, that we had each other and that was enough. But I sometimes wondered if Harold mourned the children we never had, the legacy that would have borne his name. I know I did. Without children, Harold's nieces and nephews became our primary family connection. We attended their birthday parties and graduations, their weddings and baby shower. We were the generous aunt and uncle, the ones who could afford to give substantial gifts, because we didn't have our own children to support. Harold loved playing that role, loved being seen as successful enough to help out the younger generation. The family gatherings were always at our house. Christmas dinners for 25 people, Easter brunches that lasted all afternoon, 4th of July barbecues with dozens of relatives sprawled across our backyard. I planned the menus, shopped for the food, prepared everything from scratch while Harold manned the grill and entertained his guests with stories about his latest business triumph. They appreciated the meals, of course. They complimented my cooking and thanked me for hosting, but they never asked how I managed to coordinate such elaborate events, never wondered how I found the time to prepare everything while also managing Harold's business affairs. They just assumed it was what I did, what I was supposed to do, because that's what wives like me always did. After dinner, while I cleaned up the kitchen and loaded the dishwasher, Harold would lead the men into his study to show off his latest acquisition, or discuss his current projects. The women would gather in the living room to talk about their children and their jobs, their husbands' promotions and their vacation plans. I would join them eventually, after the dishes were done, and listen to their conversations without contributing much of my own. They never asked about my work, never seemed curious about what I did, all day while Harold was out running his business empire. If they thought about it at all, I suppose they assumed I spent my time shopping and getting my hair done, living the leisurely life of a successful businessman's wife. They had no idea that I spent my days negotiating contracts, reviewing insurance policies, and managing investment portfolios that would have impressed their own financial advisors. The isolation wasn't complete, of course. I had friends from church, women I met for lunch occasionally, or worked with on various charity committees, but even with them I was Harold's wife first, and Vera second. They knew me as the woman who organized the annual parish fundraiser, who could be counted on to bring a covered dish to any potluck, who never missed a Sunday service. They didn't know about my business degree or my talent for financial analysis, or the hundreds of decisions I made every month that kept Harold's empire running smoothly. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that recognition wasn't important, that the work itself was reward enough. I told myself that a good marriage meant supporting your husband's dreams, even when it meant putting your own ambitions aside. And for 42 years I believed all of that was true. But something changed in the months before Harold died. Maybe it was the way he started talking about his legacy, about the empire he'd built and what would happen to it after he was gone. Maybe it was the way he began introducing me to his business associates, as just my wife instead of my partner or even just Vera. Maybe it was the day I overheard him telling his brother Marcus that I'd never really understood the business side of things, that I'd always been more comfortable handling the domestic responsibilities, while he dealt with the real work. I didn't confront Harold about any of it. That wasn't our dynamic. Harold made pronouncements, and I adapted to them. Harold had opinions, and I found ways to work around them. Harold saw the world a certain way, and I learned to see it through his eyes, even when his vision didn't include a clear picture of who I really was. The heart attack came suddenly on a Tuesday morning in March. Harold was in his study, reviewing contracts for a new development project, when he simply collapsed. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was already gone. The doctor said it was quick, that he probably didn't suffer, but I couldn't help wondering what his last thoughts were. Did he think about me? Did he think about the business? Did he think about all the things he'd meant to say but never had the chance to? The days after Harold's death passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and condolence calls. People brought casseroles and flowers, offered to help with whatever I needed, assured me that Harold was in a better place now. His family stepped in immediately, not to comfort me but to start making decisions about what would happen next. They talked about the business as if it were entirely Harold's creation, about the house as if I were just a temporary resident, about my future as if I were incapable of planning it myself. I let them talk. I nodded when they offered advice, thanked them when they offered help, and kept my own thoughts to myself, because the truth was, I had been planning for this possibility for years, not hoping for it, never that, but preparing for it, in the same methodical way I prepared for everything else in our complicated life. Harold thought he'd protected me by keeping me out of the real business decision. His family thought they needed to protect me from the harsh realities of financial management, but what none of them understood was that I hadn't been protected from anything. I'd been preparing for everything, and now sitting in Harold's study 3 days after his funeral, surrounded by the evidence of a partnership that no one else had ever fully understood, I was ready to show them exactly who Vera Mitchell really was. The morning after Harold's funeral, I woke up at 5:30, just like I had every day for the past 4 decades. Harold used to joke that I was more reliable than his alarm clock, always up before dawn to start the coffee and check the overnight emails from our West Coast client. Old habits die hard, even when the person you developed them for is gone. The house felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, not just empty, but expectant, like it was waiting for something to happen. I moved through my morning routine mechanically, making coffee for one, checking my phone for messages that wouldn't come. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was loaded with possibility and dread in equal measure. I'd barely slept, my mind replaying the conversations from the funeral reception over and over. Janet's concerned voice, suggesting I might need guidance with financial matters. Marcus's assumption that I'd never understood the complexities of Harold's business empire. Robert's casual dismissal of my ability to maintain the house on my own. Each memory stung fresh, like reopening a wound that hadn't properly healed, but underneath the hurt was something else, something that had been building since I'd walked out of that church basement. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was certainly some of that. It was more like clarity, the kind that comes when you suddenly see a situation from an entirely different angle. For 42 years I'd allowed these people to see only what they wanted to see. I'd played the role they'd assigned me so well, that even I had sometimes forgotten it was a performance. I poured my coffee and walked into Harold's study, the room where I'd spent countless hours managing the empire that everyone assumed was entirely his creation. The early morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where Harold's papers were still scattered exactly as he'd left them. Contracts for the Riverside Development Project, architectural plans for the new shopping center, correspondence with city planners about zoning variances. Most people would have seen chaos in that arrangement of documents, but I saw the underlying order immediately. Harold had been working on 3 separate deals simultaneously, each one in a different stage of development. The Riverside project was nearly ready for groundbreaking pending final approval from the Environmental Impact Committee. The shopping center was in early negotiations, with 2 potential anchor tenants expressing serious interest. The downtown renovation proposal was still in the conceptual phase, waiting for Harold to present it to the City Planning Commission next month. I sat down at Harold's desk, not in the small chair I usually occupied in the corner, but in his leather executive chair that had cost more than some people's cars. It felt strange at first, presumptuous, like I was trespassing in a space that wasn't meant for me. But as I began sorting through the papers, organizing them into logical groupings, the feeling of displacement faded. This wasn't Harold's office anymore, it was mine. The first thing I did was call Harold's attorney, William Brennan, a man I'd known for over 15 years, but who had always treated me like a pleasant accessory to Harold's business dealing. When his secretary put me through, his voice carried that particular tone people use when they're speaking to someone they consider intellectually fragile. "Vera, my dear, how are you holding up? I know this must be such a difficult time for you. I've been meaning to call about Harold's estate, but I wanted to give you a few days to process everything." I let him finish his condolences before cutting through the pleasantries. "William, I need to schedule a reading of Harold's will. I know the family is expecting it, and frankly so am I. How soon can you arrange it?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Well, of course that's entirely appropriate, though I should mention, there are some complexities to Harold's estate that might be, shall we say, challenging for someone without extensive experience in business law. I'd be happy to walk you through everything slowly, make sure you understand your options." The condescension in his voice was so thick I could practically taste it. "I'm sure I'll manage, William. Harold and I reviewed the will together when it was updated 2 years ago. I'm familiar with the basic structure. What I need now is the formal reading so we can begin the probate process." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, well certainly, let me check my calendar."
Would Friday afternoon work for you? Say 2 o'clock. I'll contact the other beneficiaries and make sure they can attend. After I hung up, I spent the rest of the morning going through Harold's files more systematically. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just reacquainting myself with the scope of what we'd built together. The construction company was just the most visible part of our holding. Over the years, we'd diversified into real estate investment, property management, and development consulting. We owned commercial buildings in 3 different cities, residential rental properties in 2 states, and had minority stakes in several other construction firms. The numbers were substantial, more substantial than even I had realized. Harold had always been good at compartmentalizing information, keeping different aspects of the business separate even from me. I'd known about most of our holdings individually, but seeing them all laid out together painted a picture of wealth that was frankly staggering. But it wasn't until I opened Harold's personal safe that I discovered just how much I didn't know. The safe was hidden behind a false panel in the bookshelf, so well concealed that I'd only learned about it by accident 3 years earlier when Harold had needed to retrieve some documents quickly. He'd given me the combination then, telling me it was where he kept our important papers in case of emergency. I'd assumed it contained things like our birth certificates, insurance policies, maybe some cash for emergencies. What I found inside was far more complex. There were indeed insurance policies, but not just the standard life insurance policy that Harold's family had been discussing. There were multiple policies, with different companies, totaling amounts that made my hands shake as I read the number. There were investment account statements from firms I'd never heard of, showing balances that defied logic.
There were property deeds for land I didn't know we owned, stock certificates for companies I'd never heard Harold mention. But the most shocking discovery was a manila folder labeled Private Investments in Harold's careful handwriting. Inside were documents detailing a series of transactions that had taken place over the past 10 years. Investments made through a private equity firm that specialized in emerging technologies. Harold had apparently been pouring money into startup companies, venture capital funds, and technology patents with the methodical precision he'd once applied to buying construction equipment. The returns on these investments were extraordinary. A $50,000 stake in a small software company had grown to over $2 million when the company was acquired by a tech giant. An investment in renewable energy patents had returned nearly 400% over 5 years. A series of strategic acquisitions in the biotechnology sector had created a portfolio worth more than the entire construction business. I sat in Harold's chair, surrounded by papers that revealed a financial empire I'd never suspected existed. The man I'd lived with for 4 decades, the man whose every business move I thought I'd helped orchestrate, had been operating an entirely separate investment strategy without my knowledge. It wasn't that he'd hidden it from me deliberately, I realized. It was that he'd never considered it something I needed to know about. The construction business, the property investments, even the commercial real estate ventures were all things Harold had discussed with me. Decisions we'd made together even if he'd never acknowledged my contribution. But this other portfolio, this collection of high-risk, high-reward investments in industries I barely understood, had been Harold's private project. His way of building wealth beyond what our traditional business ventures could provide. The scale of it was breathtaking. According to the most recent statements, Harold's technology investments alone were worth over $15 million. Combined with our other holdings, the life insurance policies, and the liquid assets in various accounts, Harold's estate was worth nearly $30 million. I leaned back in the leather chair and tried to process what this meant. Harold's family had been planning my future based on the assumption that I'd be left comfortable, but not wealthy, able to maintain a modest lifestyle but certainly not capable of any grand gestures or independence. They'd been calculating how much help I'd need, how much supervision, how much guidance, in managing what they assumed would be a relatively simple estate. They had no idea that I was about to become one of the wealthiest women in the state. But even more than the money itself, what struck me was the realization of how completely Harold had underestimated me. He'd trusted me to manage millions of dollars in construction contracts, to negotiate deals with banks and investors, to structure complex business arrangements that saved us hundreds of thousands in taxes every year. But he'd never trusted me enough to include me in his most ambitious investment strategies. It wasn't malicious, I knew that. Harold hadn't hidden his private investments out of spite or a desire to control me. He'd simply never considered that I might be interested in or capable of understanding the technology sector, venture capital, or emerging markets. In his mind, I was the detail person, the one who handled the practical aspects of business while he handled the vision and strategy. The irony was that my accounting background had actually given me a better foundation for understanding investment analysis than Harold's construction experience had. I could read financial statements, evaluate risk-reward ratios, and assess the long-term viability of business model. I'd been doing it for years with our traditional investments. Harold had never thought to ask if I might want to apply those skills to his more exotic venture. I spent the rest of the day reading through every document in the safe, taking notes, cross-referencing account numbers with statements I found in Harold's desk drawers. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd been living two completely separate financial lives. There was the public Harold, the successful construction executive whose wealth was visible and traditional and respectable, and there was the private Harold, the risk-taking investor who'd quietly built a fortune in industries that most people in our social circle couldn't even pronounce. By evening, I had a complete inventory of Harold's estate. More importantly, I had a clear understanding of what the will reading on Friday would reveal. Harold's family was expecting to hear about a construction business, some real estate holdings, and a life insurance policy that would provide for his widow's basic needs. They were not expecting to learn that Harold Mitchell had been worth nearly $30 million. But that night, I called my own attorney. Not William Brennan, who'd always treated me like Harold's dependent, but Sarah Chen, a woman I'd met through a church committee who specialized in estate planning and business law. I'd helped her husband's construction company navigate some zoning issues a few years earlier, and we'd developed a mutual respect that had nothing to do with my relationship to Harold. "Sarah, it's Vera Mitchell. I'm sorry to call so late, but I need some legal advice about Harold's estate. Are you available to meet tomorrow?" "Of course, Vera. I was sorry to hear about Harold's passing. What can I help you with?" I chose my words carefully. Harold's will is being read Friday afternoon, and I suspect there are going to be some surprised people in that room. I need to make sure I understand all my options, as the primary beneficiary. There was a slight pause. "Are you expecting complications?" "I'm expecting assumptions," I said, "and I want to be prepared when those assumptions turn out to be wrong." The next morning, I met Sarah at her office downtown. I brought copies of all the documents I'd found, organized in the same methodical way I'd been organizing Harold's business papers for 20 years. Sarah reviewed everything with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. "Vera," she said after nearly an hour of silence, "this is a substantial estate, and from what I can see it's very well structured from a tax perspective." Harold clearly had excellent legal and financial advice. Most of it. Yes, though I think some of these private investments were made without much consultation. Harold could be impulsive when he thought he saw an opportunity. Sarah looked up from the paper. "You're familiar with all of these holdings? The venture capital investments, the technology patents, the overseas accounts?" I hesitated for just a moment. "I'm familiar with Harold's investment philosophy. He believed in diversification, in not putting all our assets in traditional market. I may not have been involved in every individual decision, but I understand the overall strategy. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. I did understand Harold's approach to risk and reward, even if I'd only recently learned about some of his more aggressive investments. And I was certainly capable of learning whatever I needed to know about the industries and markets where our money was now working. The reason I'm here," I continued, "is that I suspect Harold's family is going to have opinions about how this estate should be managed. They've already made it clear that they don't think I'm capable of handling complex financial matters on my own." Sarah's expression hardened slightly. "Are you concerned about challenges to the will?" "Not exactly. Harold was very clear about his intentions, and the will is properly executed, but I think there's going to be pressure for me to accept help in managing the inheritance. Family members who want to be involved in decisions that are legally mine to make. And you don't want that help." "I don't need that help. I correct. I've been managing Harold's business affairs for 20 years. I know how to read a contract, how to evaluate an investment, how to work with financial advisors and accountants and tax attorneys. What I need is for people to understand that Harold's death doesn't suddenly make me incompetent. Sarah smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. I think I understand what you're looking for. You want to be prepared to establish your authority immediately, before anyone has a chance to question it. Exactly. We spent the next 2 hours going over my legal rights as Harold's widow and primary beneficiary. Sarah explained the probate process, the timeline for settling the estate, and my options for managing the various business entities and investment accounts. She also helped me understand the tax implications of some of Harold's more complex holdings, and recommended several financial advisors who specialized in high net worth estate management. One more thing, Sarah said as I was preparing to leave. You mentioned that people have been making assumptions about your financial knowledge. Are you prepared for how they're going to react when they learn the true scope of Harold's estate? I thought about that question for a long moment. I think they're going to be and I think some of them are going to be angry. Angry? Harold's family has been planning my future for me, making decisions about what I can and can't handle. They've been positioning themselves as my protectors and advisors. When they find out that I'm inheriting enough money to buy and sell most of them, that dynamic is going to change completely. Sarah nodded slowly. That kind of revelation can strain family relationships. Are you prepared for that possibility? Sarah, for 42 years I've been the woman who smiled and nodded while other people made assumptions about my capabilities. I've been the supportive wife who never corrected anyone when they underestimated my contribution. I've been the gracious hostess who served dinner while the men discussed business as if I weren't in the room. I stood up and gathered my papers. Harold's gone now, and I'm done being underestimated. The rest of the week passed slowly. I went through the motions of widowhood, accepting casseroles and condolence calls, responding to the dozens of sympathy cards that arrived daily. But underneath the appropriate grief and gratitude, I was preparing for Friday afternoon with the kind of careful planning I'd once applied to Harold's most complex business deal. I chose my outfit deliberately. A navy blue suit that was professional without being flashy, paired with the pearl necklace Harold had given me for our 20th anniversary. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a competent woman who had dressed appropriately for an important business meeting. Not Harold's grieving widow seeking guidance, but the primary beneficiary of a substantial estate preparing to take control of her inheritance. I arrived at William Brennan's office exactly on time. The rest of Harold's family was already there, arranged around the conference table like they were attending a board meeting. Marcus sat at one end, flanked by his wife Patricia and their adult son David. Janet had claimed the seat directly across from William's chair, with her daughter Sarah beside her. Robert and his wife Linda completed the group, along with Harold's nephew Thomas and his wife Jennifer. They all looked appropriately somber, dressed in the kind of conservative clothing that conveyed respect for the deceased and seriousness about the business at hand. But I could see the underlying tension in their posture, the way they avoided making eye contact with each other, the careful positioning that suggested they'd already been discussing their expectations among themselves. William greeted me with exaggerated sympathy, helping me to the chair beside his desk as if I might collapse without assistance. "Vera, my dear, thank you for coming. I know this must be terribly difficult for you." I sat down calmly and placed my purse on the floor beside my chair. "I appreciate everyone being here. I know Harold would have wanted his family to understand his final wishes." William cleared his throat and opened the leather folder in front of him. "Before we begin, I want everyone to understand that this is a formal legal proceeding. Harold's will is a complex document, and there are significant assets involved. I'll read through the primary provisions, but I suspect there will be questions afterward." He began with the standard legal language, the formal declarations about Harold's mental state, and the revocation of all previous wills. The family listened politely, but I could see their impatience growing. They wanted to get to the substance, to learn exactly what Harold had left and how it would be distributed. The first specific bequest was to the church, $50,000 for the building renovation fund. There were murmurs of approval around the table. Harold had always been generous with religious charities, and the amount was substantial enough to be impressive without being shocking. Next came the family bequests, $25,000 each to Marcus, Janet, and Robert, $15,000 each to the nieces and nephew, $10,000 to various cousins and more distant relatives. Again, the amounts were generous but not surprising. Harold had always taken care of his family at Christmas and birthdays. It made sense that he'd continue that generosity after his death, but I noticed something that the others missed. The total of all these bequests was less than $200,000. For a man who'd owned a successful construction company and lived in a $500,000 house, it seemed almost modest. Harold's family was pleased with their inheritances, but they weren't impressed by the overall scope of what they were hearing. That was when William's tone changed slightly, becoming more formal and careful. The remainder of Harold's estate, including all business interests, real property, investment accounts, insurance proceeds, and personal assets, is left entirely to his wife Vera Mitchell, with no restrictions or limitations on her authority to manage, sell, or distribute these assets as she sees fit. The room fell silent. I watched the faces around the table as they processed what they'd just heard. Harold hadn't left me a comfortable nest egg or a reasonable provision for my remaining years. He'd left me everything else. The vast majority of an estate, whose true value none of them had suspected. Marcus was the first to speak. "William, what exactly does remainder of the estate mean in dollar terms?" William glanced at me before answering. "The estate is still being appraised, but the preliminary valuation suggests total assets of approximately $29 million. After taxes, charitable bequests, and administrative costs, Mrs. Mitchell will inherit somewhere in the neighborhood of $26 million. The silence that followed was profound. I watched Janet's mouth fall open, saw Patricia grip Marcus's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. David and Sarah exchanged glances that spoke volumes about conversations they'd apparently had about their expected inheritances. Robert looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. "I'm sorry," Thomas said finally. "Did you say $29 million? That's correct." Harold's business holdings were far more extensive than most people realized. In addition to Mitchell Construction, he owned significant real estate investments, had substantial holdings in various technology and biotechnology companies, and maintained multiple insurance policies with considerable face values. Janet found her voice first. "We had no idea Harold was worth so much money. He never said anything about technology investments or multiple insurance policies." William looked at me again, and I realized he was waiting for me to respond. For 42 years I'd let other people answer questions about Harold's business. Now, for the first time, all eyes were on me. "Harold believed in diversification," I said calmly. "He didn't put all our assets in the construction business because he understood that no single industry is immune to economic changes. The technology investments were his way of positioning us for long-term growth." Marcus leaned forward. "You knew about these investments?" "Of course I knew about them. I helped Harold research several of the companies he invested in. I reviewed the due diligence reports, analyzed the financial projections, assessed the risk factors. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. I had done all those things for Harold's traditional investments. The technology portfolio had been his private project, but I understood the principles involved. But Harold always said," Patricia began, then stopped herself. "What did Harold always say?" I asked, my voice pleasant but firm. She looked around the table for support before continuing. "He always said you weren't really involved in the business side of things, that you handled the household while he handled the investments." I smiled. The same polite smile I'd been wearing to family gatherings for 4 decades. "Harold handled the public face of our business relationships. I handled the analysis and implementation. It was a very effective partnership." The room fell silent again. As everyone absorbed this information, I could see them recalculating everything they thought they knew about Harold's marriage, about my role in his success, about my capability to manage the inheritance they'd just learned about. William continued reading the will, covering the technical details about estate administration and tax planning, But no one was really listening anymore. They were all trying to process the magnitude of what they'd just learned, and what it meant for their assumptions about my future. When the reading was finished, Marcus was the first to offer his thoughts. Vera, this is obviously a tremendous responsibility. Harold's built something extraordinary, and you'll want to make sure it's properly managed. I know some excellent financial advisors who specialize in this kind of wealth management. That's very thoughtful of you, Marcus. But I already have advisors. Sarah Chen has been helping me understand the estate planning implications, and I'll be interviewing investment managers next week. Janet looked surprised. You've already spoken to an attorney. Of course. Harold died on Tuesday. I called Sarah on Wednesday. I needed to understand my legal position before this meeting. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It's just that this is such a complex situation. There are tax implications, investment strategies, business operations to consider. Harold spent his entire career building this wealth. You'll want to be very careful about any major decisions. I stood up slowly, gathering my purse and the copy of the will that William had given me. You're absolutely right, Robert. This is a complex situation, and I do need to be careful about major decisions. That's why I've been preparing for this possibility for years. The truth was, I'd been preparing for this possibility since the day Harold and I got married. Not hoping for his death. Never that. But understanding that in any partnership, either person might have to carry on alone. I'd insisted on understanding every aspect of our financial life, not because I was planning to take over, but because I believed that true partnership meant true knowledge. Now, as I looked around the table at Harold's family, I realized that my preparation was about to be tested in ways I'd never anticipated. They'd been planning to guide me through widowhood, to help me navigate the complexities of inheriting a modest but comfortable estate. Instead, they were confronting the reality that I'd just become one of the most financially powerful people in their lives. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely in the span of 30 minutes. I was no longer the fragile widow in need of protection and guidance. I was the beneficiary of an estate worth nearly $30 million. And that changed everything. As I walked toward the door, I heard Marcus call out behind me, Vera, we should get together soon to discuss how the family can support you through this transition. I turned back and smiled. That's very kind, Marcus, but I think I'll be fine managing the transition on my own. And for the first time in 42 years, I meant it. The phone started ringing at 7 the next morning. Not the gentle chime of my landline, but the insistent buzzing of my cell phone, followed immediately by the house phone. Then the cell again. I let them ring while I made my coffee and read the morning paper. The same routine I'd maintained for decades. The urgency in those repeated calls told me everything I needed to know about how Harold's family had spent their evening. Marcus was the first to leave a voicemail. His voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to sound casual while discussing something monumentally important. Vera, it's Marcus. Patricia and I were talking last night about the will reading, and we think it would be helpful if we could sit down together soon. There's a lot to discuss about Harold's business interest, and we want to make sure you have all the support you need. Call me back when you get this. Janet's message was more direct. Vera, honey, I'm so worried about you after yesterday. This is such an enormous responsibility, and I know Harold would want us to help you through it. Why don't you come to dinner Sunday? We can talk about everything as a family. Robert's voicemail was the most revealing. His voice was tight, controlled, like he was reading from notes he'd prepared. Vera, I've been thinking about what William said yesterday, and I really think you should consider setting up some kind of trust or management structure for Harold's assets. This kind of wealth requires professional oversight. I know some people at the bank who could help you explore your options. I deleted all the messages without returning the calls. Instead, I drove to my appointment with Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the financial advisor Sarah Chen had recommended. Elizabeth ran a boutique wealth management firm that specialized in what she called sudden wealth syndrome, helping people who had unexpectedly inherited or acquired substantial assets. Her office was in a converted Victorian mansion downtown, elegant but not ostentatious, the kind of place that whispered competence rather than shouting luxury.
Elizabeth herself was in her mid-50s, impeccably dressed in a way that suggested success without excess. She had the calm confidence of someone who'd helped many people navigate the complexities of significant wealth. "Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for coming in. Sarah Chen spoke very highly of you when she made the referral. She mentioned that you've recently inherited a substantial estate and are looking for guidance on management strategy." I settled into the leather chair across from her desk and opened the portfolio I'd prepared. "Dr. Morrison, I want to be clear about my situation from the beginning. I haven't suddenly inherited wealth that I don't understand.
I've been managing my late husband's business affairs for 20 years. What I need is someone who can help me optimize our investment strategies and ensure that I'm taking advantage of all available tax planning opportunities." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. That's refreshing. Actually, many of my clients come to me feeling overwhelmed by their new financial responsibilities. May I ask about your background?" "I have a degree in accounting from Ohio State. For the past 2 decades, I've been the financial manager for Mitchell Construction and our various related business interests. I've negotiated contracts worth millions of dollars, structured complex real estate transactions, and managed investment portfolios across multiple asset classes." I handed her a summary I'd prepared of Harold's estate, organized by category and including my preliminary analysis of each holding. Elizabeth reviewed it carefully, occasionally making notes in the margins. "This is very thorough," she said after several minutes. "And you're right that this portfolio requires optimization rather than basic education. I can see several opportunities for tax loss harvesting in the technology holdings, and the real estate investments could benefit from some restructure." We spent the next 2 hours going through each major asset category. Elizabeth explained advanced strategies I hadn't considered, like charitable remainder trusts and qualified personal residence trusts. She recommended tax attorneys who specialized in high net worth estate planning and suggested investment managers who could handle the more sophisticated portions of Harold's technology portfolio. "One thing I should mention," Elizabeth said as our meeting was winding down, "is that wealth of this magnitude often changes family dynamics in unexpected ways. People who've never thought of you as financially powerful may have strong opinions about how you should manage your inheritance." I smiled. "I'm already experiencing that phenomenon. Dr. Morrison, Harold's family seems to believe I need extensive guidance and oversight. And how do you plan to handle those expectations?" "By demonstrating that their concerns are unfounded." That afternoon, I called my first family meeting in 42 years of marriage. Not the casual Sunday dinners where I served food and listened to other people's conversations, but a formal business meeting where I would set the agenda and control the discussion. I sent the same message to Marcus, Janet, and Robert. "I'd like to meet with you tomorrow at 2 o'clock to discuss Harold's estate and my plans for managing it. Please come to the house prepared to ask any questions you might have about my financial capabilities or intention." Marcus called back within an hour. "Vera, of course we'll be there, but I think you should know that we've all been talking, and we're concerned about the pressure you must be feeling. $29 million is a tremendous responsibility." "Yes, it is. That's why I want to make sure everyone understands how I intend to handle that responsibility." Saturday evening, I prepared for the meeting with the same methodical attention I'd once applied to Harold's most important business presentation. I gathered financial statements, organized charts showing our asset allocation, and prepared a comprehensive overview of my management plans. I arranged the dining room like a conference room, with copies of relevant documents at each place setting, and a projection screen at the head of the table. I also made a decision about my appearance that was small but significant. Instead of the conservative dresses and understated jewelry I'd worn to every family gathering for decades, I chose a charcoal gray business suit and the diamond tennis bracelet Harold had given me for our 25th anniversary. I wanted to look like what I was, a successful businesswoman preparing to discuss a substantial financial portfolio. They arrived together, which told me they'd coordinated their approach in advance. Marcus carried a leather briefcase that probably contained research he'd done on wealth management firms. Janet brought a notepad and the kind of determined expression she wore when organizing church fundraiser. Robert had printed materials from what looked like bank brochures about trust services. I served coffee and pastries, the same hospitality I'd provided at hundreds of family gatherings. But instead of retreating to the kitchen afterward, I took my place at the head of the table and opened my presentation materials. Thank you all for coming. I know yesterday's will reading was surprising for everyone, and I want to address any concerns you might have about my ability to manage Harold's estate appropriately. Marcus cleared his throat. Vera, we're not questioning your ability. We're just concerned about the magnitude of the responsibility. Harold built something extraordinary, and we want to make sure it's preserved and protected. I agree completely, I said. That's why I've spent the past week consulting with attorneys, financial advisors, and tax specialists. I want to show you exactly how I plan to manage and grow Harold's legacy. I turned on the projector and displayed the first slide, a comprehensive breakdown of the estate by asset category. Real estate holdings, business interests, investment portfolios, insurance proceeds, and liquid assets, each color-coded and clearly labeled with current values and projected returns. As you can see, Harold's wealth is distributed across multiple asset classes and geographic regions. This diversification has protected us from market volatility and positioned us for continued growth. Janet looked confused. Vera, how do you know all this? Harold never mentioned technology investments or overseas accounts. Harold and I discussed our investment strategy regularly. He preferred to handle the public relationships with clients and contractors, while I managed the financial analysis and planning. It was an effective division of responsibilities. I clicked to the next slide, showing our 5-year performance history compared to relevant market benchmarks. Our technology investments have outperformed the Nasdaq by an average of 12% annually. Our real estate holdings have appreciated at nearly twice the rate of the regional market. Our international diversification has protected us from currency fluctuations and domestic economic downturns. Robert was studying the numbers intently. These returns are impressive, but surely Harold was working with professional money managers. For some investments, yeah, but Harold and I made the strategic allocation decisions together. We determined how much to invest in each sector, which markets to enter or exit, and when to rebalance our portfolios. Marcus leaned forward. But Vera, managing this kind of wealth going forward is going to require sophisticated financial planning, tax optimization, estate planning, risk management. These are complex areas that require specialized expertise. I smiled and clicked to my next slide, a detailed organizational chart showing the professional team I'd already assembled. You're absolutely right, Marcus. That's why I've retained Elizabeth Morrison as my primary wealth manager, Sarah Chen for ongoing legal counsel, and Davidson and Associates for tax planning and preparation. I've also engaged Thompson Risk Management for insurance analysis and Miller and Company for investment research. The room fell silent as they absorbed what they were seeing. This wasn't a confused widow asking for help understanding her inheritance. This was a competent businesswoman who'd already taken control of a complex financial situation. Janet was the first to speak. When did you have time to set all this up? Harold just died a week ago. I've been preparing for this possibility for years, Janet, not hoping for Harold's death, but understanding that either of us might need to manage our affairs alone someday. I've known these professionals for years through various business relationships, but the technology investments, Robert insisted. Harold never talked about those. How could you have been involved in decisions about companies and industries he never mentioned? This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the test of whether I could maintain the narrative I'd constructed about my role in Harold's investment decision. The truth was that Harold had made most of his technology investments without consulting me, pursuing opportunities through professional networks I hadn't been part of. But I understood the principles behind those decisions, and I was certainly capable of managing the resulting portfolio. Harold believed in keeping different aspects of our investment strategy compartmentalized, I said carefully. He worried that discussing every potential opportunity might create anxiety or disagreement, so he preferred to research emerging markets independently and then present me with fully developed proposals. It was true enough to be believable, and it positioned me as an informed participant rather than an excluded spouse. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. That's all very impressive, Vera, but don't you think it would be wise to get a second opinion on some of these decisions? Maybe bring in a family member who could provide additional oversight. I turned off the projector and looked directly at him. Marcus, what specific qualifications do you have for overseeing a $29 million investment portfolio? He blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct challenge. Well, I've been in banking for 30 years. I understand financial planning and risk management. You're a loan officer at a regional bank, Marcus. Your experiences with small business lending and mortgage approval. Have you ever managed technology investments, international currency hedging, private equity partnerships? His face reddened. That's not the point, Vera. The point is that major financial decisions shouldn't be made in isolation. Harold would have wanted his family to be involved in protecting his legacy. Harold's legacy is exactly what I'm protecting, I said firmly. And I'm protecting it by making informed decisions based on professional advice and 20 years of experience managing complex financial portfolios. Janet tried a different approach. Vera, honey, we're not questioning your intelligence or your intentions. We're just worried about you taking on so much stress during such a difficult time. Wouldn't it be easier to let someone else handle the day-to-day management while you focus on grief? Janet, I've been grieving Harold for a week. I'll continue grieving him for the rest of my life, but that doesn't mean I'm incapable of making rational business decisions or managing my own financial affairs. I stood up and walked to the sideboard, where I'd placed copies of Harold's will and the estate inventory. Let me remind you what Harold's will actually says. He left me complete authority over his estate, with no restrictions or limitations on my decision-making power. He didn't establish a trust with family oversight. He didn't name co-executors or advisory committees. He left everything to me because he trusted my judgment. Robert made one more attempt. But surely you can see the wisdom of getting input from people who care about you and Harold's memory. We're not trying to control your decisions, just offer guidance and support. I returned to my chair and looked around the table at these three people who'd spent their entire adult lives underestimating me. I appreciate your concern and I value your love for Harold, but I need you to understand something very clearly. I don't need your guidance, I don't need your oversight, and I don't need your protection. The silence that followed was profound. For 42 years these conversations had followed a predictable pattern. Harold's family would express opinions about business or financial matters, and I would listen politely while they assumed I didn't understand the complexities they were discussing. Now, for the first time, I was establishing myself as the person with the most knowledge, the most authority, and the most right to make decisions. Marcus tried once more. Vera, we're just trying to help. Harold was our brother and we want to make sure his hard work isn't mismanaged. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Mismanaged. The implication was clear. They didn't trust me to handle Harold's legacy competently. I smiled. The same pleasant expression I'd worn to hundreds of family dinners. Marcus, Harold's net worth when we married in 1981 was approximately $50,000. His net worth at the time of his death was $29 million. That represents an annualized return of over 16% for 42 years, significantly outperforming every major market index. I paused to let that information sink in. Harold didn't build his wealth in isolation. He built it in partnership with me, using strategies we developed together and decisions we made collaboratively. I didn't just watch Harold create this empire, I helped create it. Janet looked genuinely confused. But Harold always said you weren't involved in the business side of things. Harold said I wasn't involved in the public-facing aspects of our business relationships. He handled client meetings and industry events because he enjoyed that kind of networking. I handled financial analysis and strategic planning because I was good at it. It was a division of labor that played to our individual strengths. Robert was reviewing the documents I'd provided, his expression growing more troubled as he absorbed the scope of what he was seeing. Vera, even if you understand Harold's existing investments, surely you recognize that managing wealth of this magnitude requires ongoing professional oversight, the tax implications alone. Robert, I've already scheduled meetings with 3 different tax attorneys to ensure we're optimizing our liability under the current tax code. I've also retained a firm that specializes in international tax planning to review our overseas holding. I gathered my presentation materials and stood up. I called this meeting because I wanted you to understand that I'm not the helpless widow you seem to think I am. I'm a competent businesswoman who's taking control of assets I helped accumulate over 4 decades of marriage. Marcus stood as well, his briefcase still unopened. Vera, you're obviously more knowledgeable than we realized, but that doesn't change the fact that you're dealing with an enormous amount of stress and responsibility. We just want to help. I understand that, Mark, and I appreciate your concern, but what I need from Harold's family isn't financial advice or business oversight. What I need is for you to trust that Harold knew what he was doing when he left me complete control of his estate. They left shortly afterward, taking their unused research materials and their well-intentioned concerns. I watched from the front window as they stood in my driveway for several minutes, clearly debriefing about what they'd just experienced. Marcus gestured emphatically while Janet shook her head. Robert kept looking back at the house like he was trying to solve a puzzle. That evening I received 3 phone calls. Marcus wanted to schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss ongoing coordination. Janet suggested I might benefit from grief counseling to help me process the emotional aspects of my new responsibilities. Robert left a message recommending a wealth management firm that specialized in comprehensive family financial planning. I didn't return any of the calls. Instead, I spent the evening reviewing the materials Elizabeth Morrison had given me about advanced investment strategies. Harold's technology portfolio included several artificial intelligence companies that were positioned for explosive growth. His biotech investments were on the verge of major regulatory approvals that could triple their value. His real estate holdings were in markets that analysts predicted would appreciate dramatically over the next 5 years. Harold had built something extraordinary, but he'd also left me with extraordinary opportunities. The question wasn't whether I could manage what he'd created. The question was whether I could take it even further. Monday morning, I called Elizabeth Morrison to schedule a comprehensive portfolio review. I wanted to analyze every holding, evaluate every strategy, and identify every opportunity for optimization. I was done being underestimated, done being treated like a dependent rather than a partner. Dr. Morrison, it's Vera Mitchell. I'd like to schedule an intensive planning session to review my entire portfolio and develop a 5-year growth strategy. Of course, Mrs. Mitchell. How extensive a review are you thinking? I want to examine every investment, every allocation, every opportunity for improvement. I want to understand not just what Harold built, but what we can build next. There was a pause on the other end of the line. That's quite ambitious, Mrs. Mitchell. Are you thinking of making major changes to your investment strategy? I looked around Harold's study, at the awards and photographs that documented his public success, but I was thinking about the hidden investments, the private strategies, the risk-taking that had generated most of our wealth. Harold had been conservative in public and aggressive in private. Now it was my turn to find my own balance between caution and opportunity. Dr. Morrison, for 42 years I've been the conservative partner in our financial relationship. I've been the one urging caution, recommending diversification, suggesting we protect what we'd already built. Harold was the one pushing for growth, taking calculated risks, pursuing opportunities others wouldn't consider. I paused, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. Now I'm the only partner left, and I think it's time for me to embrace some of Harold's appetite for strategic risk-taking. That afternoon I received a call from William Brennan, Harold's attorney. His tone was different from the condescending sympathy he'd shown during the will read. Now he sounded cautious, almost deferential. Vera, I've been contacted by several of Harold's family members. They've expressed some concerns about the transition of estate management, and they've asked me to recommend some additional oversight structures. What kind of oversight structure? Well, things like family advisory committees, or perhaps a trust arrangement that would provide additional guidance for major financial decisions. I set down the investment analysis I'd been reviewing and gave William my full attention. William, Harold's will was very specific about leaving me complete authority over his estate. Are you suggesting that his clearly stated wishes should be overridden? No, of course not. But Harold's family is concerned about the magnitude of the responsibility you're taking on, and they think some additional support might be beneficial. Beneficial for whom, William? There was a long pause. I'm sorry, I'm asking whether these proposed oversight structures would be beneficial for me, or beneficial for Harold's family members,
who seem uncomfortable with my level of authority. Another pause, longer this time. Vera, I think everyone just wants to make sure Harold's legacy is properly protected. Harold's legacy is my legacy, William. We built this wealth together over 42 years of marriage. I don't need protection from my own financial decisions. After I hung up, I realized that this conversation was just the beginning. Harold's family had been shocked by the magnitude of his estate, but they'd been even more shocked by my competence in managing it. They'd expected to find a confused widow grateful for their guide. Instead, they'd found a capable businesswoman who didn't need their help. That realization was going to change everything about our family relationships. For decades, I'd been the accommodating sister-in-law, who deferred to their opinions and accepted their advice. Now I was the family matriarch, the one with the most resources and the most power to make decisions that affected everyone. They weren't going to adjust to that change easily, and frankly I wasn't sure I wanted them to. For the first time in my adult life, I had the financial independence to be exactly who I wanted to be, without compromise or accommodation or consideration for other people's expectations. The question was, who did I want to be? That evening I sat in Harold's study surrounded by financial statements and investment reports, but I was thinking about something much more fundamental. For 42 years I'd defined myself in relation to other people. I was Harold's wife, the church committee member, the helpful sister-in-law, the reliable neighbor. I'd been so busy supporting other people's ambitions that I'd never really considered what my own ambitions might be. Now, with $26 million and complete freedom to make my own choices, I had the opportunity to discover who Vera Mitchell could become when she wasn't trying to meet anyone else's expectations. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I thought about Elizabeth Morrison's question about making major changes to my investment strategy. The truth was, I wasn't just thinking about changing how I managed money, I was thinking about changing how I managed my entire life. Harold had been the public face of our partnership, but I'd been the analytical mind behind most of our major decisions. Now I could be both the public face and the analytical mind. I could pursue opportunities that interested me, support causes I cared about, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than familial obligation. I could stop being the woman who smiled and nodded while other people made assumptions about her capability. I could start being the woman who made her own assumptions and let other people adjust to them. The phone rang again. Janet's name appeared on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail, along with the 2 other calls that followed in the next hour. Tomorrow I would begin the process of establishing my new identity as a wealthy, independent woman. Tonight I wanted to sit quietly in the space where Harold and I had planned our future together, and imagine what my future might look like now that I was planning it alone. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt something that wasn't grief or shock or determination. I felt anticipation, the kind of excitement that comes with realizing you're about to embark on an adventure you've never allowed yourself to imagine. Harold's family thought they needed to protect me from the complexities of wealth and independence.
They had no idea that what they were really protecting me from was the chance to discover exactly how powerful I could become when I stopped letting other people define my limitations. That discovery was going to surprise all of us. The first sign that Harold's family wasn't going to accept my independence quietly came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after our dining room confrontation. I was reviewing quarterly reports from our biotechnology investments when my doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see Marcus standing on my porch with 2 people I didn't recognize. A woman in an expensive suit carrying a leather portfolio, and a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom. I opened the door, but didn't invite them in. "Marcus, this is unexpected. I don't recall scheduling a meeting." His smile was strained, the kind people wear when they're about to deliver unwelcome news. "Vera, I hope you don't mind the surprise visit. I wanted you to meet Catherine Walsh from Premier Wealth Management and David Chen from Northeastern Trust Company. They've both expressed interest in discussing your financial situation." The woman stepped forward with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Catherine Walsh. Marcus has told me about your recent inheritance, and I believe my firm could provide valuable guidance during this transition period. I looked past her to Marcus, whose discomfort was becoming more obvious by the moment. Marcus, did you share details about Harold's estate with these people? Just general information, he said quickly. I thought it might be helpful for you to explore all your options for professional management. Without consulting me first, well, I didn't want to bother you with preliminary discussions. I thought if they seemed like good candidates, then we could arrange a proper meeting. David Chen cleared his throat. Mrs. Mitchell, if I may, managing an estate of this magnitude requires specialized expertise. Many people in your situation find that family input can be invaluable in making these important decisions. I studied his face, noting the patronizing undertone that suggested he'd already been briefed on what Marcus perceived as my limitations. Mr. Chen, what exactly do you understand my situation to be? He glanced at Marcus before answering. From what I understand, you've recently inherited substantial assets following your husband's death, and you're evaluating options for ongoing management and oversight. And you believe I need family input to make appropriate decisions about my own financial affairs. Catherine Walsh intervened smoothly. Mrs. Mitchell, it's not about need, it's about wisdom. The most successful wealth management strategies involve collaborative decision-making and professional oversight. No one person, regardless of their individual capabilities, should bear sole responsibility for managing assets of this complexity. I felt something shift inside me, the same sensation I'd experienced at Harold's funeral, when his family had laughed about my supposed financial helplessness. But this time, instead of hurt or shock, I felt a cold, calculating anger. I appreciate your concern, I said evenly, but I'm not interested in collaborative decision-making with people who've arranged meetings about my financial affairs without my knowledge or consent. Marcus stepped forward. Vera, please don't take this the wrong way. We're just trying to help. Marcus, you've shared confidential information about my inheritance with strangers, arranged meetings without my permission, and brought these people to my home to question my judgment. In what universe is that helping? Catherine Walsh tried again. Mrs. Mitchell, perhaps we could schedule a more formal consultation where we could review your current strategy and identify potential areas for improvement. Mrs. Walsh, my current strategy was developed in consultation with Dr. Elizabeth Morrison from Morrison Wealth Management, Sarah Chen from Chen and Associates, and a team of specialists who were recommended by my existing professional advisors. Are you suggesting that your firm is more qualified than these established professionals? For the first time, Catherine looked uncertain. Elizabeth Morrison had a sterling reputation in the industry, and Sarah Chen was known as one of the most competent estate attorneys in the region. David Chen's expression suggested he was beginning to realize that this wasn't the confused widow Marcus had described. Of course not, Catherine said carefully. I'm simply suggesting that a second opinion never hurts, especially when dealing with decisions that will affect your financial security for decades to come. I looked directly at Marcus. Marcus, let me be very clear about something. Harold's estate is my estate now. My financial security is my responsibility. My decisions about professional advisors are mine to make, and my tolerance for family members who think they know better than I do about my own capabilities has reached its limit. The silence that followed was profound. David Chen was reviewing papers in his portfolio, like he was looking for an escape route. Catherine Walsh was calculating whether this conversation could still be salvaged. Marcus was realizing that his surprise intervention had backfired spectacularly. Furthermore, I continued, I want you to understand that any future attempts to circumvent my authority over my own financial affairs will result in consequences that extend far beyond hurt feelings. Marcus frowned. What kind of consequence? I smiled, the same pleasant expression I'd perfected over 4 decades of family gatherings. The kind that come with having $26 million and complete legal authority over how that money is used to benefit or exclude various family members. The implication hung in the air like a threat that wasn't quite a threat. Harold's will had left me everything, but it hadn't prohibited me from changing my own will to redistribute that wealth however I saw fit. For the first time, Marcus was confronting the reality that his attempt to control my decisions could result in his own financial exclusion. Catherine Walsh recognized a lost cause when she saw one. "Mrs. Mitchell, I apologize if this meeting seemed presumptuous. Marcus was simply concerned about your welfare, and we were trying to be responsive to that concern. Ms. Walsh, I'm sure you're very competent at what you do. But what you do is manage money for people who don't trust their own judgment. I'm not one of those people." After they left, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Harold's study, thinking about what had just happened. Marcus hadn't just overstepped boundaries, he'd revealed something fundamental about how Harold's family viewed my new position. They saw my wealth as a family asset that required family oversight, not as my personal inheritance that I had every right to manage independently. That realization crystallized something I'd been feeling since the will reading, but hadn't fully articulated. Harold's family wasn't just concerned about my financial management capabilities, they were concerned about losing influence over decisions that might affect their own financial interests. Harold had been generous with his family during his lifetime, and they'd grown accustomed to that generosity. Christmas gifts, graduation presents, help with down payments and business loans. Now that I controlled those resources, they were worried about whether that generosity would continue. But more than that, they were worried about whether I might use my new power to settle old scores or correct old slights. For decades, they'd treated me like a supporting character in Harold's story. Now, I was the protagonist of my own story, with the financial resources to rewrite any relationship that no longer served my interests. The phone rang an hour later. Janet's voice was strained when I answered. "Vera, Marcus told me about what happened this afternoon. I think there might have been some misunderstanding about his intentions." "Janet, there was no misunderstanding. Marcus arranged a meeting about my financial affairs without consulting me. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a deliberate attempt to circumvent my authority. But surely you can see that he was just trying to help. Managing this kind of wealth is intimidating for anyone." "Janet, do you find managing your household budget intimidating?" "Well, no, but that's completely different. You make decisions about how to spend your money based on your priorities and your judgment. You don't convene family meetings to get approval for your purchases or investments. Why should my financial decisions be subject to different standards?" There was a long pause. "Because the amounts involved are so much larger, Vera. Because the consequences of mistakes could be so much more serious, and because you don't trust my judgment." "That's not true." "Janet, if you trusted my judgment, you wouldn't think I needed family oversight to make appropriate decisions about my own money." Another pause, longer this time. "Vera, I think you're being unfair. We're not trying to control you, we're trying to support you." "Then support me by respecting my autonomy and trusting my competence." The conversation ended shortly afterward, but I knew it wouldn't be the last. Harold's family was struggling to adjust to a new dynamic where I held the power and they held the need. For 42 years they'd been able to treat me as a peripheral figure in family decisions. Now I was the central figure, and they were the ones seeking inclusion. Over the next week, I received calls from Robert suggesting a family financial planning retreat, from Patricia recommending a wealth management seminar she'd heard about, and from Janet proposing that we establish a family council to provide guidance on major decisions. Each suggestion was presented as being in my best interest, but each one involved surrendering some degree of autonomy to people who'd never before shown any interest in my opinions about financial matters. I declined all of them politely but firmly. Instead, I focused on implementing the investment strategy Elizabeth Morrison and I had developed. I liquidated several underperforming positions in Harold's portfolio and reinvested the proceeds in emerging markets that showed greater potential for growth. I restructured our real estate holdings to take advantage of new tax incentives for sustainable development. I established a private foundation that would allow me to pursue philanthropic interests while generating additional tax benefit. Each decision I made was informed by professional advice and careful analysis, but more importantly, Each decision was mine to make without consultation or compromise or consideration for what Harold's family thought was appropriate. The foundation was where I decided to make my first major statement about my independence. Instead of supporting the traditional charities that Harold had favored, I chose to focus on organizations that provided financial literacy education for women, scholarships for women pursuing business degrees, and support for female entrepreneurs starting their own companies. I announced the foundation at the annual Chamber of Commerce dinner, an event I'd attended with Harold for 20 years without ever being invited to speak. This year, as one of the region's most significant new philanthropists, I was asked to address the audience about my charitable priority. I wore a navy blue evening gown that I'd never had occasion to wear during Harold's lifetime, paired with the diamond necklace he'd given me for our 30th anniversary. I wanted to look like what I was, a wealthy woman using her resources to advance causes she cared about. The speech I gave was brief but pointed. I talked about the importance of financial education for women, the barriers that prevented women from achieving economic independence, and the role that successful women could play in mentoring the next generation. I announced that the Mitchell Foundation would be providing $2 million in grants over the next 5 years to organizations working on these issues. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Women in the audience approached me afterward to thank me for highlighting these concerns. Several business leaders expressed interest in collaborating on similar initiatives. The local newspaper requested an interview about my philanthropic philosophy, but the most telling response came from Harold's family, who had attended the dinner and were clearly caught off guard by both my public speaking appearance and my choice of charitable focus. Marcus cornered me near the coat check after the formal program, and his expression was troubled, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense to him. "Vera, that was quite a speech, though I have to say, Harold never mentioned that you were particularly interested in women's issues." Harold and I discussed many things that he didn't share with his family, Marcus, but $2 million is a substantial commitment. Don't you think you should have consulted with financial advisors before making such a large donation? I smiled. I did consult with financial advisors, Marcus. That's how I determined that a $2 million commitment was both affordable and tax advantageous. Janet appeared beside Marcus, her face flushed with what looked like embarrassment. "Vera, people are asking me about your speech, and I don't know what to tell them. I had no idea you felt so strongly about these issues." "What issues specifically, Janet?" "Women's financial independence, business ownership, that sort of thing. It's just so different from the causes Harold usually supported." "Janet, Harold's charitable giving reflected Harold's priorities. My charitable giving reflects my priority." Robert joined the conversation, carrying 2 glasses of wine, and the expression of someone who'd been drinking enough to say what he really thought. "Vera, I hope you realize that people are going to be watching very carefully to see how you handle Harold's legacy. Major philanthropic commitments send a message about your values and your judgment." "What message do you think my philanthropic commitments send, Robert?" He paused, clearly realizing that his answer might reveal more about his own biases than about my judgment. "Well, they suggest that you're more interested in making political statements than in continuing Harold's tradition of community support." "Robert, I've committed $2 million to supporting women's economic development in our community. How is that not community support?" Patricia stepped into the circle, her voice carrying the carefully modulated tone of someone trying to diffuse tension. "I think what Robert means is that Harold's charitable giving was always very traditional, supporting the church, the hospital, the scholarship fund at the high school. People understood those commitments, and people don't understand supporting women's financial education. It's not that they don't understand it," Patricia said carefully. "It's that it's so different from Harold's approach. People might wonder if you're trying to make some kind of statement about your marriage or your relationship with Harold's memory." The accusation was subtle but clear. Harold's family was suggesting that my philanthropic choices represented a rejection of Harold's values, a public statement of independence that dishonored his memory. I looked around the circle of concerned faces, these people who'd spent decades assuming they understood my priorities and my motivation. For 42 years, I'd allowed them to believe that my opinions were simply extensions of Harold's opinions, that my interests aligned perfectly with his interests, that I had no independent vision for how wealth should be used to benefit society. "You're right, I said quietly. My philanthropic strategy is different from Harold's approach. Harold supported institutions that had already proven their value and their stability. I'm choosing to support initiatives that have the potential to create systemic change. Marcus frowned. Systemic change in the assumption that women need family oversight to make appropriate financial decisions. The silence that followed was profound. For the first time, I'd stated explicitly what had been implicit in all our recent conversations. Harold's family's concern about my financial management wasn't really about my competence or my judgment. It was about their discomfort with my independence. Catherine Walsh's business card was still sitting on my kitchen counter when I got home that night. I picked it up and studied the elegant typography, the heavy stock paper, the embossed logo that suggested sophistication and expertise. Then I threw it in the garbage. The next morning I called Elizabeth Morrison to schedule a comprehensive review of my investment strategy. Not because I was uncertain about my decisions, but because I wanted to accelerate the timeline for several initiatives I'd been considering. Dr. Morrison, I'd like to discuss increasing my position in the international technology sector. I'm also interested in exploring opportunities in sustainable energy development and biotechnology research. Those are all growth sectors with significant potential. Mrs. Mitchell, are you thinking of rebalancing your existing portfolio or making additional investments? I'm thinking of taking a more aggressive approach to wealth building than Harold and I pursued during our marriage. Harold was conservative by nature, but I'm beginning to think that conservative strategies may not be appropriate for my current situation. There was a pause on the other end of the line. May I ask what's driving this shift in your risk tolerance? I thought about how to answer that question honestly. The truth was that my risk tolerance hadn't changed as much as my understanding of what I was risking. Harold had always been concerned about protecting what we'd already built, but I was beginning to realize that protecting wealth wasn't the same thing as building wealth, and building wealth wasn't the same thing as building power. Harold's family was uncomfortable with my independence, because they understood, perhaps better than I had initially, that financial independence inevitably led to social and political independence. Women with significant wealth don't need to accommodate other people's expectations or compromise their own values to maintain family relationships. Dr. Morrison, I'm 58 years old, I have no children and no financial dependence. I have enough wealth to last several lifetimes even if I never earn another dollar. Given those circumstances, I think I can afford to pursue opportunities that offer the potential for exceptional returns, even if they involve higher levels of risk. That's a very sophisticated way of thinking about your situation, Mrs. Mitchell. Most people in your position become more conservative after inheriting wealth, not more aggressive. Most people in my position have been making their own financial decisions for decades before they inherit wealth. I'm just beginning to discover what I'm capable of when I don't have to consider anyone else's opinion about appropriate risk level. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Chen arrived at my door carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone who'd been asked to deliver uncomfortable news. Vera, I hope you don't mind my stopping by unannounced. Something has come to my attention that I think you should know about. I invited her into the living room and offered coffee, but she declined. Instead, she opened her folder and removed several legal documents. I've been contacted by William Brennan about a potential challenge to Harold's estate settlement. Apparently, some family members have raised questions about the validity of certain provisions in Harold's will. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. What kind of questions? They're suggesting that Harold may not have been competent to make certain decisions in the months before his death. Specifically, they're questioning whether he fully understood the implications of leaving you complete control over assets that were accumulated through what they're calling family business enterprises. Sarah, Harold was completely lucid right up until the day he died. His doctor can confirm that he showed no signs of cognitive decline or mental incompetence. I know that, and you know that, but competency challenges don't require proof of clinical dementia or mental illness. They only require evidence that the deceased may have been unduly influenced or may not have fully understood the consequences of their decisions. I stared at the documents Sarah was holding, trying to process the implications of what she was telling. Harold's family wasn't just questioning my judgment about financial management, they were questioning Harold's judgment about leaving me in control of his estate,
Who specifically is raising these questions? The challenge is being initiated by Marcus Mitchell, with support from Janet Richardson and Robert Mitchell. They're represented by Carruthers, Baldwin and Associates, a firm that specializes in estate litigation. I knew that firm by reputation. They were expensive, aggressive, and successful at overturning wills when they could demonstrate that the deceased had been manipulated or coerced into making decisions that benefited one party at the expense of others. What exactly are they alleging? Sarah consulted her notes. They're claiming that Harold's decision to leave you complete control over his estate was inconsistent with his previous statements about family financial planning. They're also suggesting that some of Harold's recent investment decisions were made without proper consideration for the family's long-term interests. Sarah, Harold made his investment decisions in consultation with me for 20 years. We developed our financial strategy together, and we updated his will together to reflect our shared priorities. I believe that, Vera, but the challenge isn't really about Harold's competence. It's about whether Harold understood that he was excluding his family from decisions that would affect their financial future. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Harold and I had planted together 15 years earlier. The roses were blooming, the same varieties we'd chosen because they would provide color from spring through fall. Harold had never made a major decision without considering its long-term implications. Sarah, what are they hoping to achieve with this challenge? If they can demonstrate that Harold's will doesn't accurately reflect his true intentions, they could potentially have certain provisions modified or overturned. At minimum, they could establish some form of family oversight over major financial decisions. And if they're unsuccessful, they're still going to tie up the estate in litigation for months or possibly years. Even if you ultimately win, the process will be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. I turned back to face Sarah, feeling the same cold anger I'd experienced when Marcus had brought strangers to my door to question my judgment. Sarah, what would you do in my position? She smiled grimly. I'd fight, and I'd win. But more importantly, I'd make sure that anyone who challenged my authority understood the full consequences of their decision. That evening, I sat in Harold's study with a legal pad and pen, making notes about the family members who were challenging my inheritance. Marcus, who'd built a comfortable but unremarkable career in banking. Janet, whose financial security depended entirely on her late husband's pension and Social Security. Robert, who'd been asking Harold for business advice and occasional loans for decades. None of them had been financially independent during Harold's lifetime. All of them had benefited from Harold's generosity in ways both large and small, and now they were challenging my right to control the wealth that Harold and I had built together, claiming that Harold hadn't understood the implications of leaving everything to his wife, but Harold had understood perfectly.
He'd understood that I was the partner who'd helped him build his empire, the person who'd supported his ambitions and managed his resources. He'd understood that I was the one person he could trust to honor his legacy, while pursuing my own vision for how wealth should be used. Harold's family was about to learn what it meant to challenge someone who had both the resources to fight back and the intelligence to fight strategically. They'd mistaken my decades of accommodation for weakness, my preference for harmony for inability to defend myself. They were about to discover how wrong they'd been. I picked up the phone and called Elizabeth Morrison's emergency line. When she answered, her voice was alert, despite the late hour. Dr. Morrison, it's Vera Mitchell. I need to schedule an emergency meeting about accelerating several investment strategies. I'm going to need liquid assets for legal expenses, and I want to make sure my financial position is as strong as possible before I enter into what's likely to be a protracted legal battle. What kind of legal battle, Mrs. Mitchell? The kind where I demonstrate that underestimating Vera Mitchell is a very expensive mistake. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, but then again, probate hearings rarely drew large audiences. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors where Harold's family sat in the front row, their expensive attorneys arranged beside them like a wall of dark suits and leather briefcases. I chose to sit alone at the respondents' table, with only Sarah Chen beside me. We'd discussed bringing additional legal support, but I'd decided against it. This wasn't just a legal battle about Harold's estate. It was a final confrontation about who I really was versus who they'd always assumed me to be. I wanted them to see exactly what they were up against. Judge Patricia Hendricks called the hearing to order with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd presided over countless family disputes. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair, and the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of greed, disguised as concern for family welfare. This is a petition to challenge certain provisions of the last will and testament of Harold Edward Mitchell, deceased. The petitioners are Marcus Mitchell, Janet Richardson, and Robert Mitchell, claiming that the deceased lacked testamentary capacity at the time of execution, and that certain provisions were the result of undue influence. Harold's attorney, Douglas Carruthers, stood to present their case. He was everything I'd expected from his reputation, impeccably dressed, eloquently spoken, and completely convinced of his own righteousness, the kind of lawyer who specialized in convincing judges that wealthy widows were inherently suspect when they inherited their husband's fortune. Your Honor, Harold Mitchell was a successful businessman who built his wealth through careful planning and conservative financial management. Throughout his life, he made decisions collaboratively, consulting with family members and business associates before making major commitments. The will in question represents a dramatic departure from this pattern of behavior. Carruthers walked to an easel where he'd prepared a timeline of Harold's financial decisions over the final 2 years of his life. Each investment, each major purchase, each policy change was marked with dates and dollar amounts that painted a picture of increasingly aggressive risk-taking. During the final 18 months of his life, Mr. Mitchell made a series of uncharacteristic investment decisions without consulting family members who had previously been involved in financial planning discussions. He liquidated conservative holdings to invest in speculative technology companies. He purchased overseas real estate without conducting proper due diligence. He increased his life insurance coverage to levels that far exceeded any reasonable assessment of his family's needs. I watched the presentation with the detached interest of someone observing a performance. Carruthers was skilled at weaving facts into a narrative that supported his client's position, but every fact he presented could be interpreted in ways that actually supported Harold's competence rather than questioning it. Most significantly, Carruthers continued, Mr. Mitchell restructured his will to give his wife complete control over assets that had been accumulated through family business relationships. Previous versions of his will had included provisions for family oversight and collaborative decision-making. The final version eliminated these safeguards entirely. Judge Hendricks made notes as Carruthers spoke, but her expression remained neutral. Mr. Carruthers, what specific evidence are you presenting to demonstrate that Mr. Mitchell lacked capacity or was subject to undue influence? Your Honor, we have testimony from family members indicating that Mr. Mitchell expressed concerns about complex financial management in the months before his death. We also have evidence that Ms. Mitchell was increasingly involved in business decisions that had previously been handled independently by her husband. It was a clever strategy, I had to admit. Instead of claiming that Harold was mentally incompetent, they were suggesting that I had gradually taken control of decisions that he'd previously made alone. The implication was that Harold's final will reflected my preferences rather than his own judgment. Marcus was their first witness. He took the stand wearing the same serious expression he'd worn to Harold's funeral, but with an additional layer of righteous determination. Under Carruthers' questioning, he painted a picture of a brother who'd grown increasingly concerned about his financial decision-making in his final year. Harold always consulted with family before making major investments, Marcus testified. He valued our input and wanted to make sure his decisions aligned with the family's long-term interests. But in the last 2 years, those conversations stopped. When I asked about his technology investments, he just said Vera was handling the research. Did Mr. Mitchell ever express concerns about his wife's involvement in financial decisions? Carruthers asked. Marcus hesitated for just a moment. He mentioned that she was asking a lot of questions about investments she'd never shown interest in before. He seemed uncertain about some of the directions she was encouraging him to pursue. It was a carefully constructed lie, and we both knew. Harold had never expressed uncertainty about my involvement in our financial planning. If anything, he'd relied on my analysis more heavily in his final years. not less. But Marcus was betting that I couldn't prove what Harold had or hadn't said in private family conversation. Janet's testimony followed the same pattern. She described a sister-in-law who'd become increasingly assertive about financial matters, pushing Harold toward investment strategies that seemed inconsistent with his conservative nature. According to Janet, Harold had confided that he felt pressured to take risks he wasn't comfortable with. He said Vera had developed very strong opinions about how their money should be invested. Janet testified, Harold wasn't the kind of man to ignore his wife's wishes, but I could tell he was struggling with some of the decisions they were making together. Robert's testimony was the most damaging, because he focused on specific business decisions that could be verified through documentation. He described conversations where Harold had expressed doubts about certain technology investments, concerns about the volatility of overseas markets, and questions about whether he was taking on too much risk for someone approaching retirement. Harold was a construction man, Robert testified. He understood real estate, traditional investments, conservative growth strategies. These high-tech companies and biotech startups weren't his area of expertise. When I asked him about them, he admitted that he was relying heavily on Vera's research. Under cross-examination, Sarah Chen systematically dismantled each piece of testimony. She established that none of the family members had been directly involved in Harold's business decisions for years before his death. She demonstrated that Harold's risky investments had actually generated exceptional returns. She showed that Harold's life insurance increases were consistent with standard estate planning advice for someone with his level of wealth. Most importantly, she established that Harold had updated his will voluntarily, in consultation with his own attorney, with no evidence of coercion or diminished capacity. But the most telling moment came when Sarah asked Marcus about his own financial qualifications for advising Harold about complex investment strategies. Mr. Mitchell, you testified that your brother consulted with you about major financial decisions. What is your educational background in finance or investment management? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I have 30 years of experience in banking. Specifically, what type of banking? Commercial lending, primarily small business and residential mortgage. Have you ever managed technology investments, Mr. Mitchell? Not personally, no. International currency hedging? No. Biotechnology venture capital? No. So when you testified that your brother's technology investments were inconsistent with his conservative nature, you were offering an opinion about investment strategies you've never personally managed. Marcus's face reddened. I was offering an opinion based on Harold's previous investment philosophy. And how familiar were you with Harold's previous investment philosophy? When was the last time he consulted with you about a major financial decision? There was a long pause. I can't recall a specific date. Was it within the 5 years before his death? Probably not. 10 years? I'm not sure. Sarah had made her point. Harold's family was claiming expertise they didn't possess and influence they hadn't exercised in years. Their challenge to his will was based on assumptions about his decision-making process, rather than actual knowledge of his financial management. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand with the same calm confidence I'd once brought to important business meetings. I'd dressed carefully for this moment. A navy blue suit that conveyed professionalism, without ostentation, minimal jewelry, and the kind of understated elegance that suggested competence rather than trying to impress anyone. Sarah's questions allowed me to tell my story methodically, starting with my education and early involvement in Harold's business affairs. I described our partnership not as a traditional marriage, where the husband made financial decisions while the wife managed domestic responsibilities, but as a genuine collaboration where we each contributed our specialized skills. Mrs. Mitchell, can you describe your role in your husband's investment decisions during the final years of his life? Harold and I had developed an effective division of responsibilities over the course of our marriage. He handled client relationships and project management for our construction business. I handled financial analysis, tax planning, and investment research. When Harold was considering new investment opportunities, he would ask me to research the companies, analyze their financial statements, and assess the risk-reward ratios. Did you ever pressure your husband to make investments he was uncomfortable with. Never. Harold was naturally cautious about financial risks, which was an excellent counterbalance to my tendency to focus on growth opportunities. Our investment decisions were always the result of extensive discussion and mutual agreement. Miss Mitchell, the petitioners have suggested that your husband's will was influenced by your preferences, rather than his own judgment. How do you respond to that allegation? I looked directly at Marcus as I answered. Harold's will reflected 42 years of building wealth together as equal partners. Harold understood better than anyone else that I had been instrumental in accumulating the assets he was bequeathing. He trusted my judgment because he had 42 years of evidence that my judgment was sound. Under cross-examination, Carruthers tried to establish that I had systematically isolated Harold from his family's influence in order to control his financial decisions. His questions were designed to portray me as a manipulative wife who had gradually undermined Harold's independence. Miss Mitchell, isn't it true that you discouraged your husband from discussing financial matters with his family? No, that's not true. Harold chose not to discuss detailed financial information with his family because he felt it was inappropriate to share specifics about our wealth with people who weren't directly involved in managing it. But you were aware that his family had traditionally provided input on major decisions. I was aware that Harold's family had opinions about his decisions, but Harold made his own choices based on professional advice and careful analysis, not family consensus. Mrs. Mitchell, did you encourage your husband to increase his life insurance coverage in the months before his death? It was a loaded question, designed to suggest that I had been planning for Harold's death and positioning myself to benefit from it. But I'd anticipated this line of questioning. Harold and I reviewed our life insurance coverage annually as part of our estate planning process. When our wealth increased significantly due to successful investments, we increased our coverage proportionally to ensure adequate liquidity for estate taxes. Whose idea was it to eliminate family oversight provisions from your husband's will? Harold, he felt that family oversight was unnecessary, given my experience in managing our financial affairs, and potentially counterproductive if family members tried to impose their preferences on investment decisions they weren't qualified to make. Carruthers pressed harder, trying to establish some evidence of undue influence or manipulation. But every question revealed the fundamental weakness of the petitioner's case. They couldn't point to any specific instance where I had coerced Harold into making decisions against his will because no such instances existed. The final witness was Dr. Robert Sterling, Harold's physician for the past 15 years. His testimony established conclusively that Harold had shown no signs of cognitive decline or mental impairment in the months before his death. Harold had continued to pass annual physical and cognitive assessments with no indication of diminished capacity. In your professional opinion, Dr. Sterling, was Harold Mitchell competent to make complex financial decisions up until the time of his death? Absolutely. Harold was mentally sharp, physically healthy for his age, and fully capable of understanding the implications of his financial and legal decisions. Judge Hendricks called a brief recess before closing argument. I used the time to observe Harold's family, who were clustered around their attorney with expressions of growing concern. They'd expected their challenge to be straightforward. Present evidence that Harold had been manipulated by his scheming wife, demonstrate that his final will was inconsistent with his true wishes, and convince the judge to modify the estate settlement. Instead, they'd been forced to confront the reality that Harold's decision to leave me complete control of his estate was based on 42 years of evidence that I was qualified to manage it. Their assumptions about my role in our marriage had been systematically dismantled, and their own lack of involvement in Harold's actual financial decisions had been exposed. In his closing argument, Carruthers made one final attempt to portray me as a manipulative spouse who had taken advantage of Harold's trusting nature. But his argument sounded increasingly desperate as he struggled to explain why Harold's own attorney, his physician, and his financial advisors had all found him competent and his decisions reasonable. Sarah's closing argument was devastating in its simplicity. She methodically reviewed the evidence that Harold had been mentally competent that his investment decisions had been successful, and that his will accurately reflected his own priorities and values. She pointed out that the petitioners had offered no evidence of coercion, manipulation, or diminished capacity beyond their own assumptions about how Harold should have made his decisions. Your Honor, this case is not about Harold Mitchell's testamentary capacity. It's about his family's disappointment that he didn't structure his estate according to their preferences. The petitioners want this court to overturn a validly executed will because they disagree with Harold's judgment about his wife's qualifications to manage his estate. Judge Hendricks deliberated for less than an hour before returning with her decision. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen enough frivolous estate challenges to recognize one immediately. The court finds no evidence that Harold Mitchell lacked testamentary capacity at the time his will was executed. The testimony establishes that Miss Mitchell was mentally competent, that his financial decisions were made in consultation with qualified professionals, and that his will accurately reflects his own wishes regarding the distribution of his estate. She paused, looking directly at Harold's family. Furthermore, the court notes that the petitioners have presented no evidence of undue influence beyond their own assumptions about Mrs. Mitchell's role in her husband's financial decisions. The fact that Miss Mitchell chose to rely on his wife's expertise in making investment decisions does not constitute evidence of manipulation or coercion. Mitchell's authority over the estate is confirmed and absolute. The petitioners are responsible for all court costs and legal fees associated with this proceeding. As we left the courthouse, Harold's family avoided making eye contact with me. Marcus looked like a man who'd just realized he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Janet seemed stunned by the decisiveness of their defeat. Robert was already on his phone, probably trying to figure out how much this failed challenge was going to cost them. Sarah and I walked to her car in comfortable silence. The victory felt satisfying, but not in the way I'd expected. I wasn't triumphant, I was relieved. For months I'd been fighting to establish something that should never have been questioned. My right to control my own inheritance and make my own decisions about my financial future. Vera, Sarah said as we reached her car, you should know that this ruling establishes a clear legal precedent. Any future attempts to challenge your authority over your estate will face an extremely high burden of proof. Do you think there will be future attempts? Not legal ones. But family dynamics don't always follow legal logic. You may find that your relationships with Harold's family are permanently changed by this process. I thought about that as I drove home to the house that was now unequivocally mine. The truth was, my relationships with Harold's family had been permanently changed the moment I'd inherited $26 million. The court case had simply made explicit what had already been true. I was no longer the accommodating sister-in-law who deferred to their opinions and accepted their guidance. That evening I received 3 phone calls. Marcus left a voicemail apologizing for the misunderstanding and suggesting that we try to move forward as a family. Janet called to say that she hoped there were no hard feelings, and that she'd always supported my right to manage Harold's estate as I saw fit. Robert didn't call at all. I didn't return any of the calls. Instead, I sat in Harold's study with a glass of wine and reviewed the investment reports that had arrived that day. The technology portfolio was up 12% for the quarter. The biotech investments had generated returns that exceeded even Elizabeth Morrison's optimistic projections. The international real estate holdings were appreciating faster than we'd anticipated. Harold and I had built something extraordinary together, but I was building something even more extraordinary on my own. Not just wealth, but the kind of financial independence that allowed me to pursue my own vision without compromise or accommodation. The next morning, I called Elizabeth Morrison to schedule a comprehensive portfolio review. I wanted to explore opportunities that I'd been considering but hadn't acted on. Emerging markets that offered exceptional growth potential, sustainable technology companies that aligned with my environmental values, and venture capital funds that specialized in female-founded startups. Dr. Morrison, I want to discuss a more aggressive investment strategy. I'm thinking of allocating 15 to 20% of my portfolio to high-risk, high-reward opportunities. That's quite a shift from your previous approach, Mrs. Mitchell. May I ask what's driving this change? I thought about how to explain what I'd learned about myself over the past few months. For 42 years I'd been half of a partnership where caution and consensus were valued above individual vision. Now I was the sole decision maker for a substantial fortune, with the freedom to take risks that reflected my own appetite for growth and change. Dr. Morrison, I've discovered that I'm more comfortable with uncertainty than I thought I was, and I'm more interested in building wealth than in simply preserving it. 2 weeks later, I hosted my first dinner party as a wealthy widow. Not the family gatherings where I'd spent decades serving food and listening to other people's conversations, but an intimate evening for 12 women who shared my interest in using wealth to create social change. The guest list included Elizabeth Morrison, Sarah Chen, the director of the Women's Entrepreneurship Program at the State University, the founder of a microfinance organization that supported female business owners, and several other women who were using their resources to advance causes they cared about. I served dinner in the dining room where I'd once endured Harold's family's assumptions about my financial incompetence. But this time, I was at the head of the table, leading conversations about investment strategies, philanthropic priorities, and the responsibility that came with significant wealth. The evening felt like a celebration of possibilities I'd never allowed myself to imagine. For the first time in my adult life, I was surrounded by people who valued my opinions, respected my judgment, and shared my vision for how money could be used to create positive change. As my guests were leaving, Elizabeth Morrison pulled me aside. "Vera, I have to tell you that tonight has been inspiring. It's rare to see someone embrace their financial power with such clarity and purpose." Elizabeth, for 42 years, I thought financial power meant having enough money to be comfortable and secure. Now I understand that it means having enough money to be completely autonomous. 3 months after the court hearing, I received a wedding invitation that summarized everything that had changed in my life. Patricia and Marcus's daughter Sarah was getting married, and the invitation was addressed simply to Mrs. Vera Mitchell, not Mr. and Mrs. Harold Mitchell as it would have been during Harold's lifetime, but to me as an individual with my own social stand. I RSVP'd that I would attend, and I bought a gift from the registry, a crystal vase that cost more than most people spent on rent, not because I wanted to impress anyone but because I could afford to be generous without thinking about the expense. At the reception, I sat at a table with other family friends, wearing a dress that had cost more than I'd spent on clothing in any single year during my marriage. People approached me throughout the evening to congratulate me on my philanthropic work, to ask my opinion about investment opportunities, and to request introductions to the professionals I worked with. For the first time at a family event, I wasn't serving food or cleaning up afterward. I was a guest, treated with the respect and deference that came with being one of the wealthiest people in the room. Harold's family was polite but distant. Marcus made small talk about the weather and avoided any mention of business or financial matters. Janet complimented my dress and asked superficial questions about my health. Robert ignored me entirely, but their discomfort was no longer my problem to solve. For 42 years I'd managed family relationships by accommodating other people's expectations and minimizing my own needs. Now I had the financial independence to maintain relationships that served my interests and to end relationships that didn't. As I drove home from the wedding, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since Harold's death. I was no longer the woman who smiled politely while other people questioned her judgment. I was no longer the supporting character in someone else's story. I was no longer afraid of what people might think if I made decisions they didn't understand. I was Vera Mitchell, a woman worth $26 million, who had earned every penny of it through 42 years of partnership, intelligence, and hard work. I was a philanthropist, an investor and a businesswoman who made her own decisions and lived with the consequences. Most importantly, I was no longer invisible. Harold's family had laughed at his funeral because they'd thought I was helpless without him. They'd discovered that I was actually more powerful without him than I'd ever been able to be with him, and that discovery had changed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.